fundamentally we don't understand food very well. We don't know what's in it. There's so many different nutrients in food that we have absolutely no idea what they do, how they interact with, all of the other nutrients in that food, let alone how they interact with each individual. Everyone is different. My approach is really to say, okay, we don't really know anything, and that's okay. We don't need to know about all the chemical structures and metabolic pathways and all this stuff. I think it's sort of realizing that we're not going to understand nutrition super well anytime soon, and we just need to sort of apply logic and just try and build meals around what as close approximates, the wild environment.
That was Cameron Borg, and you've landed on the Me&My Health Up Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Hartcher, clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And today we have Cameron Borg doing that just for you. Cameron is a pulmonary scientist, nutritionist, writer, and the owner and author of the Ricci Flow Podcast. He is an expert on nutrition, and we're delving deep into the foundations of nutrition and helping you set up a rock solid base of good nutrition. So without much further ado, I'd love to welcome you into the conversation I'm having with Cameron Borg. Welcome on the Me&My Health Up Podcast. How are you, Cameron?
Yeah, I'm really well. Thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
I'm really excited to have you on. You're a real leader in terms of what's happening in the nutrition space. And so I'm really keen for you to share your insights on nutrition with the listeners. But before we get into, the highs and the depths of nutrition, I'd really like the listeners to understand your backstory as to how you have arrived at what you're doing today.
Yeah, so my backstory, I think, is fairly similar for most people who wind up doing what I'm doing. I wasn't really thriving. I was struggling a little bit. Found myself doing a vegan diet for about 18 months, which it's a bit of a rite of passage in this health space. It seems like everyone who sort of starts to figure stuff out was a vegan at one point. So yeah, lucky I got that out of the way quickly and learned from my mistakes, because my health got absolutely tanked from doing that. It sounds great on paper, but in reality, it doesn't mirror anything in the real world, unfortunately, or at least for me anyway. And yeah, from there, it took me to trying to understand what was more important than food, and started to realize that there were other environmental aspects that I wasn't taking into account that turned out to be a very significant part of the story. Obviously, things like light exposure, even to the extent of mindset and how big a role that plays on stress and that kind of thing as well. So really, food started to take a back seat, even though I was very interested in it. I started to think, well, what contextualizes our food choices? What makes them make sense? Because diets vary significantly in different regions of the world. So clearly there can't just be one diet, and they have to be contextualized by other aspects of the environment that we're exposed to. And that's really where I got super focused, predominantly around light exposure and the big problems that we're facing with regards to artificial light, and just how difficult it is these days if you have a normal job to get enough full spectrum sunlight exposure and avoid the artificial light. And then, the whole time I've always been very interested in nutrition. It's kind of a bit of a passion of mine, even though I don't think it's probably as important as a lot of food gurus will sort of tout it to be. But I've always been thinking about, how do we make sense of food? How do we explain all of these anomalies that we see? Some people do really well doing this, some people do really well doing that. How do we make sense of it all? And that sort of led me to where I am today. And yeah, I mean, my view on nutrition does not mirror at all what you would get taught at university. I feel like it's a very linear sort of thinking that you get taught. If you look up any sort of nutrition understanding, it comes from, very, very linear reductionistic thought. And my view is perhaps a little bit different. And that's really been cultivated by reading lots of books and mostly just thinking about the logic behind some of the ideas in nutrition. And a lot of the ideas, in my opinion, don't stand up to logic. So if we can't get past logic, how do we even get to science and doing, investigating more deeply if you can't even get past logic? So that's really the place I like to start is, does this make sense from an evolutionary perspective? So that's that's a bit about how I got to where I am now.
And what really turned your thinking, like really shifted? I mean, obviously you started on that vegan diet. So, I did the same thing, went on that vegan thing. What really, like that light bulb that really made you think more deeply about nutrition and that it's not just what we're told it is, or, like what really sort of got you that deep curiosity around nutrition? Was it a particular moment or?
There was a particular moment that really sort of shattered the illusion, so to speak. And this was the idea. There are two examples. One, that in India, all of the vegetarians are in the south. They're very close to the equator. But as you move up north, further away from the equator, they start to utilize animal foods more. And they start to utilize ghee as you get sort of towards the middle. And then they use animal fats towards the north. And then the same sort of pattern you see all over the world, where closer to equatorial regions, you see, think about Sicily and Italy, they use olive oil. You go to Rome, they use butter. You go to the northern part, they tend to use more lard and animal fats. And it was just this realization that what happens from a dietary perspective is completely contingent on the environmental factors. And perhaps we shouldn't be eating foods that don't grow locally to where we are, and what is provided locally should be the ultimate decider as to what shouldn't say what we could or could avoid, for example. So that was really the point where I started to think, okay, there can't be just one sort of framework to apply here. It has to be completely contingent on the environmental factors. The reality that we see this in all cultures, this complete dependence on what's available locally, really made me reconsider and made me start to think a lot more deeply. And I think reading Weston A. Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration was really one of the biggest eye-openers. I still tell people, read that book, you'll learn more than 5 years of tertiary education in nutrition. Easily, just read that one book, you'll know more. Because the variation between the cultures that Weston looked at was absolutely massive, yet they were all free from chronic disease. How do you explain the Swiss thriving off dairy and rye, and you see other cultures living off a completely different dietary pattern depending on where they are? So these were really moments where I started to realize that the diet was being completely informed by the other aspects of the environment that are often neglected.
And so you're in Sweden now, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So an Aussie now in Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
That, and you're sharing to eat locally. It's really important to eat locally as one of the foundations of how someone should eat the local produce. So in going from Australia to Sweden, how did you adapt in that process? Did you notice that it was a hard adaptation around the diet because you weren't used to the foods? And so I'm really curious as to how that has worked for you in terms of, not buying you probably can't get it anyway, what you were eating in Australia.
Well, I mean, the short answer is I adapted poorly. It's difficult. It's difficult coming from a place where everything is grown, so you can grow everything locally, basically, at least during the warmer months, which is most of the time. It's very, very difficult because, you get maybe 3 months of good weather here, and the rest is quite cold. During winter, you can't grow anything. The ground is covered in snow. So, and again, this is not a science-based approach. This is not like evidence-based or whatever. This is logic. This is before you get to science. Does it make sense to eat a mango imported from Brazil, here? I would say from a logical standpoint, probably not. And I have very little, although there's some, very little, peer-reviewed science to say that would be a bad thing to do. Although good and bad are not words I like to use when talking about this stuff. But yeah, it's difficult, mostly because what's available most of the year round is quite limited. I like cooking, so I don't like eating the same thing every day, and so it's been difficult. But at the same time, the body has an immense capacity to adapt and to function as optimally as possible given what it's provided. So I'm far from perfect. They have wonderful pastries and bread here, which we don't really have back in Sydney. So I've been sort of taking advantage of that. Almost everywhere you can find a slow fermented organic sourdough. That's just something you can't get in Sydney, but it's very available here. So stuff like that, I haven't been perfect with, but it's like I said, it's more about getting the other signals as dialed in as possible to make sure my body knows what to do with what's going in. But look, I also have the benefit of being a little bit younger. Young people, they can bounce back pretty easily from what they're given, especially if you get the sleep right, the light right, and the movement right. You've put yourself on a pretty good. It's been tough, but it's not the end of the world, and you can get everything here because there's all these trade agreements in the EU. You've got all this produce from France and Italy and Spain year round. You can get everything. It's in some sense it's more availability here than you could even get in Australia sometimes because they just import everything. So it's kind of nice in some sense, but from a logical point of view, it doesn't really pass the test.
Okay, so yeah, so starting with the foundation of eating what's available locally, and working with the seasons as to what's being produced coming out of the ground, or if it's not coming out of the ground, then I'm thinking for Australians, they're just coming out of winter. They're probably thinking, "Oh, I better start doing something around my health. I've been hibernating. I've been hibernating." What's the starting place for someone that's wanting to kickstart to feel better, to start to thrive if they're not thriving? So what do you think's the number one thing beyond eating seasonally locally?
I mean, the number one thing is really trying to live an outdoor life as much as possible. The more time you're outdoors, the better you're going to do. And this is for a variety of reasons. One, indoors is very dark relative to outside, even though your eyes adjust and it kind of makes it seem like they're similar. If you walk outside and you have to squint, it tells you it's significantly darker inside. Indoor lighting is generally terrible. It's very difficult to buy incandescent lights that have the longer wavelengths that we need in Australia. So most of the light you're being exposed to indoors, if not all of the light you're being exposed to indoors, is completely just visible. And not only is it just visible light, it's narrowband emission. So even though the light above your head in your office may look white, it's really just 3 narrowband peaks of blue and red and green, basically. And they trick your eyes into thinking that it looks white, but it's highly alien lighting, and it does a variety of things to the body that basically set you up for accumulating adipose tissue rather than your body knowing how to deal with the energy flow. And when you eat food, you've got lots of energy basically to deal with, and your body needs to place that in the right put that in the right place. And when it's not capable of doing so, generally it's going to store it as fat. And I think this is what we see a lot of the time. When you're outside, even if you're wearing a big coat, even if it's cold, even if it's, the middle of winter here in Sweden, you're still getting an enormous amount of long wavelength photons that go through the clothes into your body, and they stimulate mitochondrial energetics, basically. They make your cells work better. They make energy usage and utilization more efficient. And when you're inside, that just simply doesn't happen. So being outdoors just from the base, and remember this, I try and use the right language here. Being outside in the sunlight isn't good for you. It's just normal. It's what your body expects. It's the baseline. So being inside, being inside is bad for you. It's not being outside is good for you. You have to realize that our body expects to be outside 24 hours a day. There's really nothing, it's evolved for such a long time expecting these inputs. Any deviation from that could be seen as detrimental. So living an outdoor life as much as possible is really the key there, and getting outside early in the morning to get that specific signal as the sun has a particular color temperature and has a particular gradient of light that informs circadian signals, perhaps more than if you woke up and just missed the first few hours of sun and then went out in the middle of the day. Not to say that's bad, it's still better than nothing. But yeah, there are critical periods during the day, particularly first thing in the morning and as the sun goes down, that are particularly useful to be outside at. But just to keep it as simple as possible, the more time you can spend outside. And generally when people are outside, they're walking around, they're moving their bodies, they're not just sitting down stagnant. So if you do that, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone, basically.
And so just take like the person that's working in the office. how could they do this in a way that's going to work for their, I guess, life in terms of, having to be in the office and trying to maximize that? So how do you, yeah, how should they go about doing that?
I mean, the reality is it's very difficult, but you have to just do your best. And I think this gets lost a lot of the time. People feeling stuck because they're like, I know I should be outside, but I have to be at my job. And when I used to work at the hospital, I didn't have choice to go out. I was in a terrible environment. Likewise, I used to take a little incandescent bulb in and set it on my desk, so at least I was getting some long wavelength light. But yeah, it's hard, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. At least initially, you have to just do the very best you can and realize that no one's perfect. I think with social media, it's very easy to paint a picture of yourself being perfect online because you're only posting the things when you're out at the beach or you're doing a rainforest walk or whatever. But the reality is no one's life is perfect and we're all exposed to crappy light from time to time. You just have to do the best you can, and maybe it's going to be sort of a goal for you to find a job where you can maybe work from home and set up outside, where you can work outside, or I've heard some people say to buy an old vape pen and just say to your boss, I need to go have a smoke break every hour, and go out and have a sunlight break for 5 minutes. It's funny, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but seriously, these short breaks, if you can manage them, are absolute dynamite, because even 5 minutes out of every hour, if you can get that sunlight, is disproportionately good for you. So yeah, even if you get an old vape shell with nothing in it and you can convince your boss, hey, I've got to go out, I've got an itch I need to scratch, you can just go out and get some sunlight. But it really is, you have to just take every advantage that you can. No one's going to do this perfectly. No one's going to do it perfectly. So don't beat yourself up if you're in a job at the moment and, it might take you a year to change that. You just have to do the best you can. And incandescent bulbs are really helpful. If you can get some of those, set one up on your desk or two, just so you're getting some long wavelength light to, limit the damage that's being caused by narrowband light from the screens and God forbid, you've got compact fluorescents that are flickering overhead. But, you just have to take every opportunity you can to improve the situation you're in and work towards something better if that's possible.
And so in terms of like, we've got the eating locally, seasonally, spending as much time outdoors. Now, when it comes to eating and constructing a meal, there's a lot out there in terms of the construct of that meal. Through your research, and where have you arrived as to where we should start in terms of building that meal, that and the timing and things like that?
I think for most people, a pretty easy place to start is using some type of mincemeat. It's cheap and you can generally find high quality. I mean, thank God in Australia, it's all kind of high quality. You can build a dish around mince, and it's very easy to cut up an onion, shred a carrot and a zucchini, fry that with 500 grams of mincemeat, and you've got a pretty damn good meal. All things considered, it's not going to suit everyone, but stuff like that is a really great place to start because it's super easy. You don't have to go overboard. It's nice in Australia because you can find farmers that are relatively local to you, and buy direct from the farmer. And that way you know exactly what you're getting. And, just sort of building dishes around that. You can literally choose whatever vegetables or, anything that you want to swap in and out. I'm quite a big fan of like soups and stews. When you consume the cooking liquid, you're getting a lot of the minerals and things that have leached out into the water. And, when you're making soups and stews, you can use cuts like chuck steak, or you can use ossobuco or things with bone or marrow in it that sort of enrich the food and give you nutrients that you otherwise wouldn't be getting. I think that's one of the main things that sort of underpins my idea about nutrition. Is fundamentally we don't understand food very well. We don't know what's in it. There's so many different nutrients in food that we have absolutely no idea what they do, how they interact with, all of the other nutrients in that food, let alone how they interact with each individual, everyone is different. And, they're changing microbiome, and that person's going to be different a year down the track. So, my approach is really to say, okay, we don't really know anything, and that's okay. We don't need to know about all the chemical structures and metabolic pathways and all this stuff. Our ancestors didn't know any of that, and they did well, they did well because we're here. And if they didn't do well, we wouldn't be here. So I think it's sort of realizing that we're not going to understand nutrition super well anytime soon. And we just need to sort of apply logic and just try and build meals around what as close approximates the wild environment, which is very, very difficult these days. But you can get deer, wild caught deer in Australia pretty easily. There are great farmers. Like I used to get my meat from Jake Walke down in Albury area. And it's a good investment to sort of know your farmer. There's like CSA boxes you can get with organic farmers around, and that means you get food really fresh. But yeah, I mean, there's so much you can do, but trying to keep things simple, and don't forget, making a meal you really like, having a pasta every now and then is not going to kill you, especially if you like cooking and you like experimenting with new flavors and things. Don't be concerned if your tomato comes, your tomato sauce comes from Italy every now and again. Don't be so dogmatic about it, because it's not going to it's not going to kill you. And you need to enjoy food. There's a saying, I wish I could remember it. It's an Italian saying that basically translates to, you do not age around the dinner table, meaning that time spent sharing food with friends and family is very, very important, and you don't age when you're doing that. And I think that's something that I really like about Europe, is they tend to spend more time eating food together, and enjoying food together, which I think has huge impact on how food is treated by the body as well. So there's so many things that you can do that are super simple, super logical, and I think that would be a great place to start for anyone. I mean, just eating normal, real food in its most unprocessed form is a great place to start.
And the timing of meals, like, have you come across, like, there's a lot of people at the moment that are sort of skipping breakfast, or this sort of thing around intermittent fasting, and so that timing is that important in terms of getting the timing right?
It appears to be extremely important, and the literature is very, very clear that skipping breakfast is not a good thing long term. And if you're doing intermittent fasting, it should be the last meal before bed that should be skipped, or it should be had early, or a smaller dinner, for instance. The literature seems to be very clear that a larger breakfast and a smaller dinner is generally going to yield better results. I tend to be a larger dinner kind of person. I really like cooking something nice for dinner, but giving a bit of time, a few hours between your last meal and time for bed is a really, really big thing, because the intake of food also acts as a circadian signal. So larger breakfast, and if you get your sleep and circadian rhythm right, a lot of people say, I'm not hungry at breakfast. You should sort of wake up and feel like you need to eat. That's generally a sign that you're doing the circadian thing right. So a larger breakfast and a smaller or earlier dinner, maybe not smaller, but an earlier dinner, is generally a good idea. In my opinion, the literature seems to support the fact that skipping breakfast is associated with much increased risk in diabetes, for instance. Why that is, I'm not particularly sure. It may just reflect the fact that people who are skipping breakfast are also neglecting a lot of other aspects of their health. But yeah, it does seem that the timing is very important. And yes, intermittent fasting, as long as it doesn't limit the amount of food that you're taking in. A lot of people who, like myself, I can't afford to lose more weight, for instance. So intermittent fasting is not really the best idea for someone like me. But yes, it can be extremely useful, and timing is important. If you can get a good meal in relatively early in the morning, hopefully as you're outside in the morning light, generally is a good idea.
And there's the debate around macros, and like I've heard you talk about in your podcast about the whole no fat thing, right? That started in the 80s, I think it was, and how we've become very conscious of fat, and that's sort of been stripped out of the way which we eat, and hence carbohydrates has come in a big way, and now we're seeing carbohydrates as that's the evil thing. We've got to do no carb or low carb and things like that. There's always been protein. And so I'm really keen on your take here as to the macro composition, as to what people should focus on as the most important thing.
It's a tricky one, because macros are sort of like the most zoomed out you can get to understanding the contents of a diet. Personally, I never even consider macros because I'm not sure it's particularly helpful. The only macro I'm really interested in discussing is protein, because we don't have a storage organ for protein, which is why we have to take any excess nitrogen that's in that protein and pee it out. It's waste, otherwise it turns to ammonia and it becomes toxic. We can store carbohydrates very well. Everyone knows we can store fat very well, much to our chagrin sometimes. But the reason protein needs to be prioritized is purely because we don't have a storage organ for it. And that means that protein must be consumed in a more regular fashion because, like I said, we just can't store it. So it needs to come in more regularly to supply the needs. Now, how much? This is a debate I prefer not to get into because you've got people on both extremes. Some people saying, yeah, you only need, 50 grams a day to be fine and, not lose muscle mass. And you've got other people who say 1 gram per pound body weight, which is a lot. Really, I think it just depends a lot on your lifestyle as well. And I think it also needs to be considered how intelligent the body is and wise the body is in being able to take exactly what it's given and work with it. There are cultures where, and I think I've been reading a little bit about the grizzly bear in Yellowstone, and when there are good years of pine nuts, they will gorge on pine nuts like they will stop eating meat, for instance, and prefer pine nuts. And they will have really big summers where they'll subsist predominantly off pine nuts. And you think, because they're omnivores like us, you think, are they getting, the right macros? And of course, each year, depending on what's supplied by nature, their macros are completely different leading up to hibernation. So I don't think, there's not this one framework that you need to work with. Perhaps depending on what's going on, one day you might do like an 80-10-10 sort of thing. Who knows? You might be at the beach and you might be doing a fruit day or something. But then the next day you might hit gym really hard and tear a lot of muscle tissue and you've got to build it back up. You might be a carnivore that day. I think there's just so much variation, and the animal world tells us about that. If there is availability, same with blueberry bears, if there are blueberries, bears will gorge on blueberries to the extent where their meat is quite prized because it tastes like blueberries. So if you look at the animal kingdom and you look at our ancestors, we took advantage of whatever was available. And sometimes that meant gorging on 4,000 calories of honey at once, like the Hadza do, which would make us vomit, but they love it. They gorge. So it's such a fluid thing. And I think as long as people are using this idea of protein prioritization, because our body does prioritize it. And I've done a podcast with Stephen Simpson and David Rubenheimer, who have been the proponents of the protein leverage hypothesis, which is basically to say, because we can't store protein, we eat to a protein level and then our satiety mechanisms kick in. And if that protein is diluted, let's say you're eating chips, which are the perfect example of a protein diluted food, high in starch, high in fat, you can eat an seemingly endless amount without getting full because nothing about that protein lever is being used. Whereas if you eat 6 eggs, you're going to have trouble getting a 7th in, so our body is really sort of centered around knowing it's getting enough amino acids in, and then the rest sort of gets taken care of. And in a wild food environment, if you eat enough protein from wild food sources, generally the rest of the nutrients are coming along for the ride. So that's why we don't have specific appetites for zinc or copper or thiamine. It's because if you prioritize protein, then you solve the other problems just by prioritizing protein itself. So a good friend of mine, Jim Laird, he's a strength and conditioning coach. He says a fist size amount of protein at every meal, and then accompaniments, vegetables and fruits and stuff, whatever's available locally. At a very zoomed out level, that's going to work pretty well for the vast majority of people, particularly women. I think women tend to undereat protein a lot. Something I see all the time. And the consequences of which can be quite broad. There are plenty of people out there talking about it. But like I said, macros is a tricky one because it's going to change meal to meal, day to day. And don't stress if your macros are let's say you significantly undereat protein one day. Don't stress. Your body's going to sort it out. Once you get back on track, your body knows what to do, especially if you're getting all the right signals from the environment.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, like, when you look at the vegan diet, you can see why, like over long periods of time, you could become quite protein deficient very easily. It's quite hard to do. You got to eat like lots and lots of legumes, grains, nuts, seeds in order to
Yeah.
get that quota or get your meat.
And usually, in situations like that, it's not an absolute protein deficiency. It's generally going to be one or two amino acids that become quite limited. And generally, those are going to be some that are critical in a variety of pathways, like, even tryptophan or tyrosine play incredibly important roles in hormones and the synthesis of melanin, for instance. So, what you don't want is to not have a protein deficiency, but have an amino acid deficiency that goes undetected because no one checks for that kind of stuff. But yes, it's a problem. And the problem is with the balance of the diet as well.
And you mentioned at the very start about mindset, and you sort of touched on it a few times in, relation to how you see food and not worry about, whether the tomato sauce is from Italy and having a bit of pasta here and there, and then eating as a family. It's really important. You become ageless or that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
just share like your journey around the mindset of food, because it's a big one. As the eating disorders are very prevalent these days, particularly with the young and even later on in age as well. And everyone's had a challenge with this whole connection with food. So I'm really keen to get your take on this mindset around food and what's a healthy mindset.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you an example. So during summer this year, I went to Italy and stayed with a friend. And I love Italy because I've only been twice, but both times I was like, I'm going to eat whatever I want because I'm in Italy and I'll worry about it later. And, we were just in the most beautiful place. We stayed in the Alps and I ate pizza and pasta and, cured meats and cheeses. And I never felt better in my life. I was eating a diet that, on paper you would say I should be feeling terrible. Never felt better in my life. I did all these huge hikes up the mountain fueled by basically wheat flour. And yeah, like never felt better in my life. And it just makes you realize that there's so many other things that play into how food is used in the body. And it's an eye opener to realize that a lot of the stuff I think we put in our own heads about how certain foods should make us feel. If you think any wheat product is going to make you feel not so good, then that's probably what's going to happen. And there are studies looking at self-proclaimed gluten intolerant individuals, and they're in placebo-controlled trials, and they can't significantly pick which one's the placebo and which one's the gluten containing muffin, for instance. So I think a lot of this stuff is in our head, and I think just realizing that we don't understand nutrition very well, and that we're not going to, at least within my lifetime. It's sort of freeing just to go, okay, well, let's not worry about the minutia. Let's just work with logic and realize that when you give your body all the right signals, it's going to take the food you give it and it's going to do the best thing with it. I think becoming significantly less orthorexic or like obsessed over food has been quite a blessing because it just lets you enjoy food. Food is something that should be enjoyed as well. I think that's up there with nutritional content. Food is something that should be enjoyed and hopefully enjoyed with other people. And I think again that makes a huge difference to how you're treated, how your body treats the food that you're eating. And yeah, it's a big factor. Eating disorders are such a big problem, particularly in young women who just like don't want to eat anything. Everything's bad. And yes, like all this media, you've got these guys like Dr. Gundry who are saying all this stuff's poisonous, really grinds my gears, because if you're having a reaction to a potato or an eggplant, the question you should be asking is, why is my body reacting so strongly to something like this? We've been eating these foods for thousands of years. Why now are people having issues with this? Not, I can never eat that again. So I think that's sort of my perspective, is to be a little bit less harsh on yourself, particularly if you're doing all of the other things right, and to enjoy food with people. And as far as digestion is concerned, go for a walk after you eat. It's the best thing you could possibly do for digestion. I think a lot of people who have issues with digestion, I can't digest this or whatever, just go for a walk after you eat it. It'll generally sort it out.
Fantastic in terms of what you shared. Yeah, very much getting back to the basics. Nothing overcomplicated, in terms of the very beginning, in terms of eating locally and seasonally, eating what's available, and then spending more time outdoors, making sure that we're getting the timing right. We're not, eating late at night and too close to bed, and eating during those daylight hours, and getting that first meal in, making sure it's a good meal, focusing on the protein. So really appreciate these insights that are so practical and very easy for listeners to implement. If they want some personalized help and support, how can they best connect with you?
There are a number of ways. I write quite a bit on my Substack. So if you just search, I think if you search my name and Substack or Ricci Flow Nutrition Substack, it will show up. I also have Instagram, and I have like one of those link trees where it gives you all the links to everything that I do. My podcast is also going strong, Ricci Flow Nutrition Podcast, and that's everywhere as well. I'm still doing lots of interviews and talking to lots of people, and hopefully just continuing to try and give as much free information as possible. I'm trying to basically make a platform that I wish I had when my health was not good. Trying to just give out as much information, as much detail as possible. And people can reach out to me through those platforms.
And the name Ricci Flow Nutrition, that's always intrigued me, given that I'm an avid listener of your podcast. Where's it come from?
In hindsight, a bit of a regrettable name. I should have just called it Cameron Borg Nutrition, but it's sort of stuck now. I can't really change it. But Ricci Flow is it's a concept in mathematics, in topology, that looks at basically shapes in multiple dimensions and how they can be impacted to bring them back to a singularity. So you can imagine a very complex shape, and then it gets molded back to a singularity. And I thought that was a really good sort of metaphor for what happens when people are ill, is that you have to gently mold every aspect of the curve back until it's uniform again, which is what sort of my logo points out. I have a Substack post called Why Ricci Flow that sort of explains why. Again, very regrettable choice in hindsight, but I made it so many years ago, and that it's stuck now. I can't change it. So that's where we are. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll change it to Cameron Borg Nutrition.
It's very meaningful.
Yeah.
Never too late to change the name. So I really appreciate you coming on, Cameron. It's been a delight to have you on, and I'm sure there's lots to talk about, and I'll have you back in the future if you have the time. And all the best with your studies in your Masters of Nutrition, and have a wonderful day in Sweden.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand Me&My Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. Me&My Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you may to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information. Changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, Me&My Health Up disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast, and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of Me&My Health Up.